talking about today is partly what I worked on for my senior league, which was specifically e-portfolios. But I wanted to talk about portfolios more generally, so I think that's a more useful conversation to start with for us as a group. And this comes out of a lot of work that the first year committee has done over the past several years in various phases and forms, and many of you here have been involved in that conversation at one point in time. But I thought to kick things off, I would read a quote from sort of grande dame of portfolios, Kathleen Yancey. And one of the reasons why I'm compelled to use portfolios and think it's a valuable tool for us, not only as teachers, but from the programmatic standpoint, is really for this reason. So she says, and I deleted, when we ask students to build portfolios and write effectively, we ask students to participate with us, not as objects of study, but as agents of their own learning in a process that's a product. And for me, if I'm going to think about any form of assessment, whether it's going to be programmatic or as an individual teacher, I want it to have more than one purpose. I mean, we can sometimes get trapped into thinking that assessment is something that happens, that we do separate from our students, that we use for ourselves, that we use for the university, that we use to make cases for external parties. But I want a form of assessment that actually does something for students, and I think that's one of the things that portfolios do. And portfolios get used in a lot of different ways, and I'm just curious how many people here already use portfolios in some shape or form. Yeah, so I think we all do in one way or another. So probably some of the things that I'm saying today will be sort of preaching to the choir, but hopefully it helps us start a conversation about where we might go next, beyond just individual teachers, but also as a program thinking about portfolios. Okay, so the possibilities, and this is a little bit of background, but also some of the things that we kind of embrace as part of portfolio pedagogy. So way back when I started, a few years after I started, we did an external review, and this was one of the recommendations that the external reviewers made. They said, you all should really think about embracing doing portfolios as your form of assessment. So that got me thinking, and also nationally portfolios are considered to be best practices when it comes to writing program assessment, both from the WPA and from the NCTE. One of the programs that we can look at, or that often gets touted as a good model program, is Washington State. They have a great portfolio program that's been around for a while. And the way that they have set it up, after you take your first year course, you do a sort of mid-academic career portfolio that you have to pass to get into their upper division writing in the disciplines course. So it becomes a kind of a gateway for them as a way of helping students, demonstrate that they've mastered the skills that they need to be in the upper division courses. So the benefits are for students. Obviously, they are participating in their learning. They're engaging in a form of self-evaluation, self-assessment. And in some ways, I'm not sure that they get many opportunities to do that in some of the other kinds of classes. If you think about some of the other classes that are based more on kind of content transmission, where the assessment often is multiple choice tests at the end of the semester. You have to figure out, okay, can I regurgitate the content that's been transmitted? All right, that works, but definitely not a good model for a writing program. So this is a way of asking students to really be a participant and do some self-evaluation. I mean, how often do we sit down and take a semester, 16 weeks worth of work, throw it all out on the floor, or open a bunch of tabs on your computer and just say, I mean, wow, I've done a lot of stuff. And to at that week 16 go back and look at some of the things you wrote in the first week, I mean, that in itself is a great experience. So that's another reason that I think portfolios are valuable, because there's a kind of learning that happens that, quite frankly, I don't even care if I see in some ways, because it's happening with what the student is doing with their own writing. I do hope that it shows up in their reflective writing, but the process itself is, I think, useful. So for us as teachers, we get the benefit of a better understanding, too, of how our students see our classes and see themselves as writers. They have to explicitly articulate what they see are their strengths and weaknesses as writers, and that may or may not match up with what we see. So we get a better understanding of our students, how they're perceiving our classes, and then obviously for the program, if we do portfolios on a programmatic basis, we've got a huge body of data that we can work with to talk about what happens in our classes, to make cases for the administration and for other stakeholders. So it's the classic win-win. You can't talk about portfolios without talking about the mantra. And if we all had more space, we're kind of crowded. But we could genuflect to the south, because that's where Kathleen Yancey, she teaches in Florida. Keep the mantra, but I won't make you do that. But it is a good way of remembering the key components of the process and why portfolios are useful for writing students in particular. And that is that students have to collect their work. They have to go back and actually look at the body of work that they've produced. And that in itself is kind of a revelation. Often they realize the kinds of different things that they've done over the course of the semester. But then the key is when they have to make choices. When they have to make choices to put them in a portfolio, they are engaging in this very intentional kind of self-evaluation that says, I'm choosing to put forth these pieces of writing because they demonstrate something that's really useful about what I've done over the course of the semester. And then the reflecting is the articulation piece. So they have to talk about that explicitly. Okay, Perils, and this is one reason why it's hard to implement portfolios, especially in a program of our size. There aren't very many really large research institutions that do portfolios on a programmatic basis. There are some, but it's hard to do. And that's partly a time factor. And if you imagine reading, I mean, if we have, 3,000 students and we want, say, 20%, like a 20% sample, that's a lot of portfolios. And say those portfolios are 10 or 12 pages long, that's a lot of pages, or screens, if they're electronic. The other peril, one of the other perils is sometimes reflective writing can get a little too warm and fuzzy, a little squishy, like, oh, I think I'm a good writer because I really like this piece, this narrative I wrote, because I got to write about my summer in Nepal, and it was really fun. So we have to think strategically about reflective writing, how that's framed, and teach our students how to do reflective writing, and do that in really explicit, well-designed ways. It's also expensive. As with the timepiece, you can't really ask people to read portfolios without being compensated. It's going to be a lot of money, although there could be alternate forms of compensation.
Food.
Yeah, food.
Trip to Hawaii. Portage.
Yeah, let's trip to the Hawaii. Maybe also Hawaii. And then they aren't always, assessment isn't always easily quantifiable with portfolios. You have writing, but I'm not sure that there's any way that there's anything that's easily quantifiable about measuring writing. So it's the same things that we face as teachers when we grade. What's the sort of subjectivity involved? What are the specific criteria that we're using? And then the last question. So imagine all of us, and I think we should actually do this more often, putting together or looking at a portfolio and trying to all come to the same evaluation of that portfolio. I think we would be here a long time. I think it would be a great conversation, and I think we should have conversations like that more often. But sometimes outside, people outside a writing program will question the reliability of the assessment because, we're subjective, and we read things differently, we score things differently. So, as we were thinking about this from the committee standpoint several years back, we looked at an article by Ed White, who's also kind of a guru of assessment, and he talked about the problems, the sort of historical problems with portfolios and difficulties, and his response is, okay, well, let's think about this a little bit differently. If what we're really concerned about is evidence of student learning, let's craft a really good, precise, concrete prompt for that reflective essay. And then when you read the portfolio, you really only read the portfolio, that reflective essay carefully, and everything else in the portfolio is just evidence to sort of check in on. So his recommendation is you craft a prompt that's tied explicitly to the goals of that course. You have students write very concretely about the goals, then tie their writing directly to the goals. Use their own writing as evidence. They quote themselves. So that way, you read a hopefully really well-written, reflective essay, look at the portfolio just to see whether or not it actually supports the argument that the reflective essay makes, which I think is a great approach. But that means that we have to be really good at teaching reflective writing. And I think that sometimes is harder than it seems. I use a lot of reflective writing, and I think there are different levels. There's a lot that's been written about reflective writing and different ways that it can be used. I'm going to just kind of go through these sort of quickly. I think of the first level as just sort of a general, might be early on in the process. Hey, what do you think? What's going on? What are your questions? What are you worried about? This sort of giant net that says, I just want to know what students are thinking about right now. The second level is a little bit more specific and directed. I typically assign something like that in the middle of the process. And I'm now asking students to think more specifically about this writing task. So, and to identify what do they need to do to take the next step. Is it a question of content, structure, etc. And then also ask them to be explicit about what they're going to do. Okay, I know what I need to work on, and here's my plan for doing it. And then the last level is a kind of final reflection, so you ask students to think back on the process. And one of the things I think that could be really useful at this point is asking them to define things. Like I asked them, okay, we just did this rhetorical analysis essay. For first year students, many of them it's the first time they've written that kind of essay. They're still a little fuzzy on what that means. So I want them to articulate for me their definition of what this thing is that they just wrote, and then map that definition onto their own writing, and talk about specific parts of their writing that support that. And then this also is giving them training for that last portfolio, where they're going to have to do the same thing, except for not with one assignment, but with the course goals. So over the course of the semester, they're getting exposure to reflective writing that's getting them ready to do that last cover essay at the end. And then this is an example of that prompt. Very text heavy. Sorry, bad design, I know. But it basically asks students to pick one of the learning goals, one or two of the learning goals, define it, and then map their writing onto it, and then also think about how they'll move forward with their writing beyond the end of the semester. So now, okay, so I'm going to end up just by talking a little bit about e-portfolios, open it up for conversation, and then let Carrie take it. E-portfolios are a way of mitigating a couple of other problems with portfolios. Number one, storage. Can you imagine where would we put boxes and boxes and boxes of paper-based student essays? I have several of those, and they got wet in the mud.
Linda said she would do it.
Yeah. Record-based.
She'll delegate it to Alex.
So that's one relatively minor problem solved. But also e-portfolios open up a lot of possibilities for how we read and score essays. And I would always advocate that we, as human beings, be the primary readers, because I think it's valuable for us as teachers. I think that's how we gain the most in terms of what we would do as teachers within the program. But there is I call it the lure of big data. So there are a lot of ways that we can look at what happens in student writing when we have those samples available electronically. And I think John has used the phrase linguistic maturation, tracking linguistic maturation.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great phrase. But there are ways to do that, and that, of course, becomes really handy when we need to talk to the administration, taxpayers, whoever we need to talk to about what we're doing, but also for us in the long term to get some sense of kind of globally what's happening with students. And one of the other questions that I've been interested in is now that as the Common Core is being implemented in the majority of the states, how is that going to show up in student writing? I mean, are we going to start to see things look a little bit different in our student writing?
Yes.
As they, yeah, yes. Is that good?
Oh.
So to have that kind of global perspective, but also just what do we need to be doing more of as teachers? we can talk, we know individually what's happening within our classes, but that doesn't always tell me what might be useful for us at the program level. So if students are clearly not understanding the argument goal, well, then we should be talking as faculty about how to do a better job of teaching that and providing resources for that. So there are a couple of models. There's a lot of, so the options that we would have would be third-party vendors. There's a lot of them out there, but many of them are not specifically for writing programs. So when we talk about portfolios, often they're this very broad category that gets used in a lot of different ways on campuses. And there's quite a few small to mid-sized campuses that have students do an academic portfolio, not just their writing classes, but things from, you know, their entire academic career as a form of public presentation when they graduate. We wouldn't have quite the same purposes, so some of the third-party, you know, the vendor software might be useful, might not be useful. In some ways they can be adjusted and sort of customized. Sometimes they can't. There's cost involved there, of course. Do we pay? Do students pay? Usually, of course, it's the students who pay. The other option is that we could build something ourselves with OIT. And Engineering Honors Program has already done that. Obviously, they have a really different model for what they're doing with their portfolios, but they've largely used Google Docs. And since we're a Google universe now, university in the Google universe, isn't everyone? That might be one option. We have more control. We get to decide what the parameters are, what it looks like, but obviously a lot more work on that end and a lot more technical stuff that I don't know very much about. And we'd have to really rely on OIT to help us figure some of that stuff out. But there are a couple of models, and I'll look at.
Dr. Pearce?
Yeah.
What is the lure of
Dr.
big?
Pearce.
What is the lure of big data?
Okay, good question. So there's a lot of discussion right now in academic circles about big data. Some of that's connected to the alternate discussion that we're having about MOOCs. Some of it's just connected to the fact that there are technologies now that allow for kinds of parsing of huge databases of stuff that haven't been possible, say 5 or 10 years ago. And so there's a lot of interest in using really, really, really big collections of stuff to look at global trends. So, I don't know. Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, I mean, there's smarter people in the room with assessment and data than I know, but at least what I've seen, how big data being used in a good way. I understand the underlying tone of that question, which I'm one of those people who question it as well. My wife is actually in charge of big data curriculum building and uses specifically big data to teach thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of students at Jeffco. What it allows for, it allows for showing trends within curriculum that are failing, basically, and you can see it right off. But unfortunately, it can also be used to see trends in certain classrooms that are problematic, and so forth, they don't trend to the norm with you. But for the most part, it's really used in order to figure out, you know, where is writing at this moment, and how do you create a vertical curriculum to where we're engaging students and saying this is what we believe writing is, and these are the data points that we believe in, and we kind of look at those. So it's not necessarily to oversee the Jacobian sense, right? Which although it can be,
yeah.
But as you and I have been talking about this for a while, we're more interested in the organic, student-centered approach out, right? And seeing where we're going from there, rather than kind of thinking that big data used as some other way to basically peer into someone's classroom, which does no one any good. I mean, we don't have Senate Bill 180, 190, or whatever the heck it's called, right? Where they're using big data in order to, basically assess teachers like a CSAT, which is crazy.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, and I think we would probably all agree that it would be beneficial for us to see global trends, but it's not about the accountability of the teacher as much as it is, what do we learn from the data that helps us do stuff better? That's an articulate answer. So does that answer? Okay. And Rolf, would you add anything?
Just with big data, you see what you can code for. And so if you can code for for example, sentence length, or things like that, and you see that as a virtue, then maybe, you'll see, mean sentence length and things like that, but that may not be, in fact, a good indicator.
Right.
Coding. So, exactly, a lot of, how do you code for rhetorical concepts and rhetorical terms? How do you code for a particular claim, or the role of a claim in a
We code
in
for
a piece?
thinking.
Right. And so you can do certain things with paragraph cohesion, with sentence length, with mean length of words and things like that. But those can be actually poor indicators for rhetorical sophistication, as opposed to just. So again, it's what you can code for, and that often replaces what you really need to look for.
Right.
And those are two different things.
And there's been a lot of discussion on the WPA periodically off and on about just that, and RetComp scholars strongly negative reaction to things like AccuPlacer, which is the sort of electronic scoring of writing that looks for things like that, but famously has been fooled by some RetComp scholars who submitted gobbledygook and got a great score, stuff like that. So.
Yep.
Those mischievous red comps.
So I thought I would just wrap up by showing a couple of websites. This is at Stony Brook, and they use, and look at that, Programming, Writing, and Writing, PWR. But they use e-portfolios. They use a product called Digication, which is fairly well known. Again, it's kind of a general academic portfolio product, and I think they use it in a broader campus sense, but you're sorry, that's not true. So they tout the fact that they have a national, international attention from bodies such as Making Connections, and we'll look at the AAEEBL in just a second. But they have showcased some of their student portfolios, and you'll see that they might look different than what you would imagine. I mean, they're visual. Some of these are private, but this student has made his public. So he's got a really beautiful photo, and the fact that he's interested in photography sort of kind of speaks to his interests. And again, some of these models or portfolios might serve different purposes. I don't know that if we were implementing this in the first year, that we would be necessarily wanting to make them public to the whole world. I don't know. I mean, we'd have to talk about that as a program, whether or not we would view this as students making their work public beyond the writing classroom, or as students making their work, available within the sort of writing program. So this is a very kind of a public model of e-portfolios. And then the other thing that I wanted to show you is in the state of Minnesota, they have a statewide portfolio system. So it's not just one campus, it's available for anybody in the state. It's affiliated with the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities and University of Minnesota, but it's actually this whole statewide enterprise. And I wanted to show you what their higher ed page looks like. So this is some of the things that they do with their higher ed portfolios. Administrative, to query individual sites for outcomes, ability to set global announcements, reporting, questionnaire builder to customize portfolios, evaluations. So they've got this range of things that they do, and it's, of course, in some ways pretty heavily tied to assessment. But those are a couple of the different kinds of ways that e-portfolios have been used in different universities. I mean, University of Minnesota is a really large university, so, and they've been at this for a while. And then the last site that I thought I would show you is the site of one of the organizations that's kind of one of the professional organizations that does a lot with e-portfolios. Again, it's not specifically for writing programs, but I love this. The Association for Authentic, Experiential, and Evidence-Based Learning. So they have one of the longest, most complicated, I mean, it might even be longer than what, the new college? Isn't it even longer?
Looks like it's time for help.
But they are an organization that we would probably look to. There's a lot of resources. A lot of people over the past decade, couple of decades, have been doing great work in thinking through the same kinds of questions that we would be thinking through. So this would be one organization that we can look to as providing some answers. So that's my spiel.
Thank you.
Certainly. Ask any questions or just talk.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I went to that FTEP summer technology workshop. Some other people here too did, and I admit I didn't take advantage of everything that they offered, but they showed us that on D2L you can do.
That went away, actually. Yeah.
Well, what they said was you have to meet with them and they would set it up for you.
Right.
So it's not there. I mean,
Right.
and I thought down the road maybe I'll.
Yeah, maybe
So
we
you
could.
can't do that?
Yeah, this is an interesting
Oh,
point.
that's
So D2L does have an e-portfolio feature that we used to have,
Yeah.
but apparently, as they've been negotiating with the D2L people, it also, all of those individual features cost money, and virtually nobody was using the e-portfolio feature, so it went away. I mean, if we really were committed to it, we could probably argue or advocate for it, but I'm not sure that that would be what I'd recommend, because it's pretty clunky. So.
And they demonstrated it
Mhm.
at the time, and what they were saying was, and it reminds me of a cross between some of the ones you've shown.
Mhm.
It was cool because it seemed like it was something that the students would then have, whether they made it public or not, that they could take with them when they went to look for a job.
Right, and that's often how e-portfolios are sold. So this is a body of work that students can take with them. It's their public face
Mhm.
when they graduate to look for jobs.
But I mean, I think that could be one of the purposes. It wouldn't have to be the sole purpose, and they definitely had reflection in there.
Right.
And the way it was set up was you would annotate your essay
Right.
with your reflection.
Right, yeah, right,
And there's
so
two-
you can actually comment on it.
Two points to that. On the one hand, the new college actually, when we were building the curriculum, we talked about portfolios for that exact kind of model.
But I think
And-
the oh, go ahead.
And then the other thing is, Lonnie and I actually met with Bedford to hear what they were saying with they're in their very nascent stages of this, but everyone seems to be kind of talking about them right now, what how to do them, but unfortunately, you brought up, the one that we talked about very quickly here is it's costly, it's time consuming, and it means also really serious questions about what curricular verticality means
Right.
in order to create portfolios that have some sort of coherence. And that is a really hard and long discussion. So it's different than just building the software for it, but unfortunately it's not build it and they will come. Actually, you can build it, spend a lot of money on it, and the program or whatever the department is simply will have so much argument over what that debate is of what a portfolio looks like. For example, in creative writing, we all use pretty much portfolios, but there is no way anyone's ever talked about what should be in a portfolio. Good God, that would be the detriment, right? But everyone knows you do them, and they're important, because that's kind of the creative writing model, right? But it's something that, this is also, I guess you could say, e-portfolios ironically become a discussion about curriculum and the very mission of the program. So it's not simply just building a kind of a site, if you will.
Well, and also think about we have a one semester first year course. We don't have the luxury of having 2 semesters. And this would mean, if we implemented this, we would have a common standard assignment that would come at the end of the semester that we would all have to teach. In a really crowded semester, that's a challenge. We would all have to make choices about how we negotiate that, how we include more reflective writing, get students ready. But I know your original question was about D2L.
Well, no, I mean, just one follow-up thing to this, as in creative writing, I mean, why can't it be a tool, or ideally, it would be a tool, I think, that people could make their own? Why would it have to be all the same? In fact,
Well, I
it
think
would
for
be
assessment, if we're keeping the
Well, for
assessment.
assessment.
Yeah, we have the discussion, is this for assessment or is this, the argument is, okay, so do we build it, we say, okay, this is gonna be one of our 8 goals that we have. We say we're gonna do portfolios, but unfortunately, when you do that, it'll stop at the end of the class. Right, like in the creative writing class, it literally ends, that is gone. There's no way for me to kind of reflect upon the different types of assignments I've had, the difference, say, for example, an erasure essay or a hermit crab essay or whatever, and what's really working across the board, because it just dies with it. It's just, and we could make a decision of that though. We could say, you know what, we just want it to be for the class, and it'll be electronic, mine are electronic, and we aren't gonna be looking over big data, but, you know, unfortunately, as some people have trained me so well to understand, you know, we are gonna have to constantly, in order to be stronger, aggregate data.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, particularly if you're thinking about portfolios in a first year writing class, is that a body of material that students are gonna necessarily use in a really public way to get jobs in, I guess. If it were, you know, upper division or linked to upper division,
Yeah.
it might be, but it's very different, I think. than
Now,
it's just-
portfolio certificate would be interesting.
Well, as a matter of fact, the certificate envisions a practicum
Yeah.
component of 3 to 6 credit hours.
Yeah.
And one of the options for that practicum would be a certificate, a portfolio building opportunity, whether it's a formal course where you develop the portfolio or simply a requirement for the certificate.
Yeah,
We'll see about that.
yeah, which I think makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm gonna, one more question, and then I
One more
wanna
question,
take
we'll
Terry's
transfer.
time.
Yeah, Terry.
Okay, if we're not going to summative route where we're doing assessment portfolio, can you suggest to faculty here that don't use portfolio some of the formative ways that you could use it in the classroom
Oh, sure.
to the benefit of the students?
Yes, yeah, in fact, that's a great question. Sometimes, and I know another model of using portfolios in the classroom is a unit-based model. So you have a mini portfolio around an assignment. So students will submit certain things that they've done, brainstorming, some of their notes, some of their reading responses, when they submit their final assignment, whatever that is, and have them do some reflective writing either in class or as a homework assignment. And that way you get a good focused look at, okay, what happened in this particular unit for this particular assignment. So I think that's another way to use portfolios just within an individual classroom. That's going to be great too.
Just one last thing, I just want to make a point. Let us really transfer over, I'm sorry, maybe we can do some in discussion at the very end after Carrie. But we are some way going to have to figure out what this means though for our program. So, you know, Lonni is kind of spearheading this. She's going to be presenting to the FAC, presenting to people, so we can figure this out. So I feel there's enough here, as does the FAC and a number of people, that this is kind of a direction we want to at least explore. To say maybe it doesn't work for us at the very least, or to say maybe we should use this as our model. I'm not sure where. I don't care to say where, but I know it's interesting. And there you go.
Like I said, I think it's great. The reason that I think portfolios are useful from an individual teacher standpoint or from a programmatic standpoint is because there is that student learning that's involved. It's a form of assessment that students participate in. Even if we don't always see that, they do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.